to start this conversation, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to go over the goals of the class with the students. It's important that you do this because it helps students have a framework for the way that the class is going to go. And for sure, once you've given the okay for students to step out or take care of themselves if something becomes uncomfortable, this can kind of prep them for the tough conversations that are going to be happening over the course of the class. So there's several goals that you'll go through. It's important that you let them know that we're going to be talking about how survivors are never to blame for things that they've experienced. We're going to be talking about myths and facts and trying to help students recognize that there are a lot of myths that exist about sexual violence, and these myths help to condone that harm and violence. We're going to talk on the difference between sexual harassment and flirting. Then we're going to talk about how to give and also how to receive consent, and then recognizing how to set sexual boundaries. So, like I said, there's a lot of hard topics. This helps students have a framework for what's going to be coming up and kind of to help them be prepped for these conversations. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define some key terms that we'll be using throughout the presentation. The first term and the topic of this lesson is sexual violence. So sexual violence is a sexual act committed against someone without that person's freely given consent. Now that's a really important element of this entire presentation, and something that we want students to be familiar with is that that key piece of sexual violence is that consent is not present. Someone didn't agree to that behavior or say okay to that behavior. Now, the other term that we want to define and talk about for a second is survivor or victim. Survivor is a term for someone who has experienced domestic violence, sexual assault, or rape. Now, survivor and victim can be used interchangeably. We tend to use survivor. Now, if you're talking to an individual or referencing one individual's experience, it's their choice whether they want to be referred to as a survivor or victim. But for most presentations, most classes, I tend to use survivor. So the first activity that we're going to go through is we're going to talk about those myths mostly those myths that exist about sexual violence. We want students to recognize that by believing these things, we are helping to condone or accept this violence. So you'll go through each of these. This conversation often brings up big feelings, big emotions. Students often want to talk about it. Sometimes they disagree. Sometimes there's misunderstanding in what the scenario is meaning. Make sure ahead of time you read the outline so that you understand the point of each conversation, and also understanding that key point will help you bring it back if students are taking it to very specific stories or examples. Those key pieces of why it's a myth or fact will help guide those conversations. So we'll go through one. So the first is sexual assault usually occurs because people cannot control their impulses and desires for sex. Now, this is a myth. Sexual violence is about power and control, a differential in power and control. It's not about the sex. And this is something that you can reiterate to students. Let's do one more. So people who commit sexually violent crimes may appear to be well-adjusted and even well-liked. This is a fact, right? We see that oftentimes there isn't necessarily one type of person who causes other people harm. It can really be anyone. And so we want students to kind of remove that image in their head of who a perpetrator may be and recognize that it could be people who are well-liked. It could be those people that maybe we didn't have in mind. So you'll go through each of these myths and facts. And it's really important that you don't skip the last one, which is sexual harassment is a form of sexual violence. This is a fact, and it will transition you into the next topic of conversation, which is sexual harassment. So the first thing that you'll do is you'll define what is sexual harassment. So we've talked about sexual violence. Now, sexual harassment is a form of sexual violence. What is it? It's unwanted, unwelcome, and uncomfortable behavior that has an impact on an individual. So I often will write these things on the board. So I'll write, even though it's on the PowerPoint now, I'll write it on the board to reference in the next activity. So I'll write unwanted, unwelcome, uncomfortable, and it has an impact. This will help guide students in coming up with their answers to the next scenarios. So before you get into those scenarios, you're going to define different behaviors that are physical sexual harassment. In the outline, there are several examples. It's super important that you familiarize yourself with those examples so that you can help students. Now, with this, I often will invite them to come up with examples and tell them to me, whether that's I give them a minute on their own to think, I have them work in groups or pairs for a minute, and then we discuss, or whether they're just shouting out. It's important that you have ideas in your mind in case they may not feel comfortable sharing or just don't have ideas. And that's true for the next couple of slides, because you're going to talk about physical sexual harassment, then you'll talk about verbal sexual harassment doing that same activity, and then you'll talk about visual sexual harassment, also going through different examples, helping students see behaviors that are unacceptable and considered harassment. Now, we've talked about